everyone, and welcome to season 4 of National Parks Presents. Today is our second to last presentation, and our last one will be Wednesday, April 24th. This is something we've been doing actually the past 4 years because we're in season 4, and it has evolved as the seasons have gone on. We usually start them mid-January and we usually end at the end of April. So it's coming up fast and furiously, actually. I still can't believe it. This series covers a multitude of topics. All right, so many. The Rangers are incredibly brilliant, and so they can do topics on anything. And I asked them today to try and focus more on the BPL's overall programming theme, which is revolutionary music, and how we interpret it. Revolutionary music is music for social change, and all of the amazing music that has kind of stemmed out of Boston, which is so cool. And I'm excited to go on a deeper dive of that. But before I go over boring Zoom's features, I do want to remind people that the Boston Public Library is a repository of National Park Service materials along with other government publications, and these can be found at the Research Services Department at the BPL. You can always email ask@bpl.org. I also want to shout out, because I know I usually go straight to library resources, but the National Parks of Boston have incredible resources and incredible walking tours and super fun things to do all year long. So even though we're slowly coming to an end because it's beautiful out and it's hard to fight the weather, you guys can keep learning and keep going on these amazing educational tours all through Boston. I'm definitely going to pop their website into the chat. So definitely check them out before you return and see us again in January for season 5. But some boring Zoom features. We are recording. You can hear all of my hellos from this season and from previous ones on the BPL YouTube playlist. All right, we have a wonderful playlist of all of the presentations of seasons past, and you can check them out anytime. If you are not enjoying the captions that you are reading below, you can click on the CC button to turn them on or off. And as always, you can click on the Ask bubble and you can ask those questions in the chat. Don't be shy. We just ask you to be respectful. The amazing Ranger Sean is going through and moderating the chat, and he'll pull your questions and ask them at the end so we don't kind of interrupt the flow of the presentation. When you type in your question in the chat, notice the to form, all right? Because it's either going to go to everyone, which is everyone, or it's going to go to host and panelists, which is everyone you see on the screen. So just be aware of what you would like to do. Before you leave tonight, before you X out of everything at the end, there is a survey that will pop up. If you could fill that out, that would be awesome. And now, guys, I've gotten pretty good at wrapping this up in a 3-minute window. So without further babbling from me, let's welcome Ranger William Watson as he presents the American Revolution and the Boston Tea Party.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks for the introduction. And welcome to the program. Excited to be presenting about this topic this evening on Boston's American Revolution, WBCN, and the Boston Tea Party. So thank you all for coming out. This story we're going to talk about today is about revolutionary radio and music. The famous, or WBCN, famous broadcasting channel, and the Boston Tea Party. And this is a story more than anything else about music, change, youth, commerce, running straight into revolution. And depicted here in the picture, I have the WBCN studios in the 1960s and the Boston Tea Party stage, the image from the Velvet Underground band, and the famous image with the stage name above the stage, Praise Ye the Lord. Between 1967 and 1973, the Boston Tea Party and WBCN were the voice for a social and political revolution in the United States. Music intertwined with movement politics to support civil rights, the anti-war movement, women's rights, LGBTQ plus rights, in a decade of vast change. The young DJs at WBCN transformed the music and drove the movement into overt political action. And they became the social media of the 20th century, connecting social justice issues in a direct conversation with their audience. Depicted here in slide 4 images of the Boston Tea Party as it looks today. The Arc, which was the theater where the Tea Party moved in 1970, and the WBCN studios as they look today. And that's a poster for WBCN, the radio station that was so important in driving this social change. The Tea Party, Boston Tea Party, has important meaning and symbolism in American history. Of course, going back to the original Boston Tea Party, 1773, and the destruction of the tea, and its connection to the American Revolution, and the mythology around the destruction of the tea, to the Women's Tea Party movement in 1873, 100 years after, which argued for women's suffrage and the right to vote, to the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s. We'll quote here from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1964, referring to the importance of the Tea Party in its history and legacy for the civil rights movement in the 1960s. In our American tradition, he said the Boston Tea Party has an important place, and referred to it as initiative, important for the example of the initiative of young people in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And depicted here, we have some of the images of important individuals who would work to make WBCN and the Boston Tea Party such an important legacy. Depicted here is J.J. Jackson, one of the first African-American DJs in the United States. Danny Schechter, who was an important, extremely important news commentator. Bill Lichtenstein, who would be an important news commentator as well, and go on to be a great investigative journalist. Peter Wolf and Charlie Daniels, DJs at the Boston Tea Party. Of course, Peter Wolf go on to become part of the Jay Giles Band. And Maxine Sartori, who would be important in introducing Boston to some of the most important musical and rock acts of the 1960s and 70s. And these were young people at the time, young DJs, people who were looking for a change. And as these people and many others would break down the barriers of WBCN and connected WBCN and connect to the audience and what is essentially equivalent of a social media movement as we would know it today. So what is a revolution? Well, revolution, important understanding when we're talking about, is constituting or bringing about a fundamental change, is how Webster's defines a revolution. So the Boston Tea Party would be a revolution, as it would bring and WBCN would be a revolution as it brought about fundamental change in the way Americans looked at themselves as part of this part of this movement in the 1960s. So why music and radio? Why are they so important, and why do music and radio drive so much of this movement? Well, in the 1960s and 70s, America was in the midst of radical and social change. The civil rights movement in the United States was reaching its peak by the mid to late 1960s. The women's rights movement was reaching its important peak as well. The gay rights movement in the United States was reaching important movement for LGBTQ plus people in the United States. And of course, the anti-war movement. And popular music is becoming a place where in the United States, and mostly in the United States as we talk about today, where genders, ethnicities, and youth move past older social mores. Blues, rock and roll, and R&B were viewed with disfavor by many in the older generations and music has come to be the voice for change and unsettlement. So talking about change and technology and change, what's the technology and how is all this change coming about in the late 1960s? Well, to understand that, you have to go back a little bit, a few years, to understand some of this technology that's coming about. And that begins with in the late 1940s with the invention of the humble transistor radio. Before the transistor radio, music and radio was generally broadcast in uh, uh, large for, rooms that were large appliances that were large and required you to be in the same room to listen to. They're large, bulky machines. But in 1958, the transistor radio is invented, and young people can take the radio with them and listen to their own music in their own rooms. Almost simultaneously, and probably not coincidentally, was the emergence of rock and roll in the early 1950s. This depicted here is Little Richard, important founder of rock and roll music. So civil rights and racial understanding in the United States are coming together, and technology are coming together at the same time. At the same time, you have artists like Chuck Berry, who are beginning to be listened to by white and black audiences. And then, of course, you have Elvis Presley, who is considered one of the first rock stars playing largely African-American music listened to by largely white audiences. And at the same time, or shortly after, you have the explosion, the invention of television comes to individuals' homes. And television really helps to create and make rock and roll a largely known entity in the United States. Television turns early rock music into not just a visual, but not just an audio, but a visual presentation as well. And rock music, rock and roll music, and visuals will be connected thereafter. So if you were living in Boston in the late 1950s, early 1960s, what would you be listening to when you turned on your car radio? What would you hear at that time? Well, if you turned on the car radio, you would largely be in listening to contemporary music. You would likely hear music called Top 40. This is an image of a WMEX in Boston, which was a Top 40 station. So what was Top 40? Well, Top 40 is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's Top 40 music. It's essentially the same hits, Top 40 hits played over and over again, usually accompanied by a DJ projecting an exaggerated character voice. An example of that would be a man named Arnie Woo Woo Ginsburg, who was one of the most well-known early rock and roll DJs in the early 1950s and early 1860s in Boston. But by the early 1960s, this format had become stagnant and ripe for change. Essentially the same music playing over and over again. And a lot of the early independence of rock and roll music had also been driven out by events like the Payola corruption scandal, which had devastated local radio stations and independent DJs. But local music was very important in Boston in the 1960s, even though it would often be segregated by race. Jazz music, rhythm and blues music, often played in African-American neighborhoods, including, as depicted here, the Golden Nuggets, Wally's Jazz Club, and Izzy Ort's Bar. So these were some of the places, well-known places you could go to listen to this type of music at the time. And at the same time as these music venues are taking place in the early 1960s in Boston, you also have the folk revolution, making folk music very important in the United States, and Boston and Cambridge are important centers for that. Depicted here, we have Joan Baez playing at Club 57 in the early 1960s. Joan Baez and Bob Dylan would both play at Club 57 and Club Passam, as it was known at that time, in the folk revolution of the early 1960s. But what would really change everything in the early 1960s was this band, the Beatles. Image depicted here of the Beatles playing at Suffolk Downs in 1966. Image of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It was the Beatles who would define the music scene for the 1960s. Their popularity defined the look and style of a rock band in this era. They defined the set of a band, a four-piece band, rock and roll artists as well-trained musicians who had the look and sound of rock stars. And they set the tone for touring in the 1960s with what a band at that time through that era would be. When the Beatles retired from touring in 1966, they again redefined what recorded music would sound like. They popularized the concept of an album with their famous albums Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. An album was more than just a group of random songs. An album would be a group of songs that told a story or a concept. And because of the popularity of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, singles and 45s would lose popularity, and the 33 or full album became more popular among young people, leading to the formation or the success or the paving the way for entity or studio radio artists like WBCN radio station. And one of the most important figures of this movement, which would make this a reality, was this man, Frank Barsalone. Frank Barsalone was known as the godfather of rock and roll. Many promoters at this time were coming on the scene who appreciated the new music form of rock and roll and understood the potential of rock and roll as a business. Before Frank Barsalone, rock music was seen as primarily the domain of misfits and hooligans, similar to traveling circus performers. Few critics or businessmen took rock and roll seriously. But it was Frank Barsalone who revolutionized the music industry. Barsalone was the first promoter to book major British acts in the US, including the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who, the Yardbirds, and the Jimi Hendrix experience. It was Frank Barsalone who created the farm system that drove the rock industry and promoted these scenes, rock scenes in various US cities. And one of the first to take up that, promoting those scenes was this man, Bill Graham. Bill Graham was one of the first to promote and open specialized concert venues for rock acts in the United States. Bill Graham promoted the opening of the Fillmore West in San Francisco and the Fillmore East in New York City. The Fillmore West, under Bob Graham, sponsored small music venues in markets to play new acts which become famous. For example, in San Francisco, the Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead. And later at the Fillmore East in New York City, the Allman Brothers Band and many others. And the man that would promote this music scene in the city of Boston was a man named Ray Rippin. Ray Rippin believed that Boston could be a profitable music city, as quoted here in the slide. This is an image of Ray Rippin in the 1960s. Rippin was a Kansas City lawyer who came to Boston in 1966 to attend Harvard Law School and become a rock promoter. In 1967, Ray Rippin said, or to quote Ray Rippin later in 1971, referring to that time, he said, "There was a tremendous void in Boston. I just moved in to fill it. A lot of people were talking about a place to play acts, just starting out and establish acts, but no one was doing a damn thing about it." So Ray Rippin would step into that void And in 1967, he would work to purchase a club in Boston, or a building in Boston known as the Moon Dial. This is the image of the Moon Dial in 1967. Ray Rippin bought an interest in this building. The building itself was an 1870s Unitarian church on 55 Berkeley Street in Boston. It was originally been dedicated to the abolitionist Reverend Theodore Parker. The plan was to turn this building into a film school, along with one of Ray Rippin's partners and Andy Warhol. When the deal fell through, Rippin was left holding a stake in this old 19th century building. And instead of going broke, as Ray Rippin said later, he decided to turn it into a music venue. Quoted later as Rippin would say, "Boston could be a great music town with hundreds of thousands of students in Boston. The best chance I had to pay the rent of this thing was to play rock music there and have a rock club." So the Moon Dial would become this well-known club for the Boston Tea Party. Again, it is a former Unitarian church. It had been built in honor of Theodore Parker, the abolitionist, built by the husband of Isabella Stewart Gardner, John Gardner. On January 20th, 1967, the building would reopen as the newly christened Boston Tea Party. Again, the Tea Party had important implications in the 1960s. Tea Party, of course, referred to the American Revolution and its legacy, and the legacy of the Boston Tea Party. It also had other meetings as well, tea at the time being a popular drug among the youth of Boston. So Tea Party had multiple meetings, and that would be incorporated in the name of the site from the beginning. One of the first bands to play at the Boston Tea Party, or excuse me, the first band to play on January 17, 1967, was a band called The Lost. The Lost were a local band, and they would be the first to later historically open up the Boston Tea Party. This is an image for that band, The Lost. In their opening of the venue, they would play there several more times as a locally touring band. Here we have an image of early bands as well, the Beacon Street Union and a band named Ill Wind. Local bands would be the ones who would generate interest in the Boston Tea Party and drive interest in young people coming to this 400-person arena on Berkeley Street in Boston. And it's important to remember that these were all local bands. Being a band at the time, a band in the late 1960s, had become representative of being part of a larger counterculture. It was a way of saying, I'm not part of the mainstream of society. I'm different, and I have my own voice. And that's what many of these young people were doing as they came to the Tea Party. And the Tea Party became Boston's local expression of this, as rock music by the late 1960s had become the voice of a revolutionary generation. And these bands, their image, and the politics that they represented blended today in a way that doesn't always translate in the 21st century. Ray Rippin's next venture would be in radio, and this is an image of the WBCN control board again in the late 1960s. Radio, as Ray Rippin saw it, and others as well, saw the potential of a new form of radio market to promote this new live music that people were listening to. After Sgt. Pepper's in 1967, young kids were replacing 45s with 45 singles with albums, and they realized the potential of having a place to play these albums, apart from simply the single random songs that are being played at the time. Rippin had first pitched his idea of a rock format radio station in Washington, D.C. in 1967, and he was not received well. They told him at the time, you had better go back and practice law. There's a quote here that they told Ripon in 1967. Of course, he didn't do that. He persisted in his venture to create a radio station, and this would translate into Boston in 1967. Depicted here in this image, we have a man named Mitch Hastings, and we have Joe Rogers, aka Mississippi Harold Wilson, in the middle of the picture on the right, and a classical music disc jockey in the bottom left. Hastings was a really fascinating man. He was an eccentric inventor starting early. He was a classical music lover, and he was the owner of the WBCN network of radio stations in 1967. Hastings was the inventor of the car radio, and he had worked on the project to invent the transistor radio. He had established a chain of classical music stations in New England and New York, and his goal was to bring music to the public, classical music to the larger public. But this venture had not been successful, and by 1967, all his radio stations were nearly bankrupt. It was Ray Ripon who would approach Hastings and the board at WBCN with the option of playing this new music format at their station. With a lot of convincing, eventually Ripon convinced them to give this music format a try in a 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. slot on WBCN in Boston. And the man who would begin this, or the person who would begin this music, be the first DJ, was Joe Rogers, depicted in the middle on the right image. Famously on famously in 1967, Joe Rogers would begin with the song "I Feel Free" by Cream as the first song that he played. Depicted here is Sam Copper. Sam Copper would be hired as the talent man for WBCN. It was Sam Copper who would hire and bring in many of the DJs who would shape the sound of WBCN, and who would help WBCN to break down many of the discriminatory barriers that existed in the radio industry in the 1960s. So many of the DJs we'll talk about here were brought to WBCN by Sam Copper. The famous motto of WBCN would be "Ugly Radio is dead," as depicted in this image on the left. And this would describe this new format of music. WBCN would air originally on a limited 10 p.m. slot on WBCN, and it was March 15th, 1968, that the American Revolution would officially turn on, with Joe Rogers famously, as mentioned earlier, playing the song on the station's new altered format, "I Feel Free" by Cream, setting the tone for WBCN. David Bieber of Boston Magazine described the music of WBCN in a different form of, different from many other stations who were playing the music at the time. He said the music is all flows and moods, and properly dispersed, sparks can flash between cuts. So this is a much more looser format of music with different types of music being played, much different from the top 40 format that was common at the time. And one of the pioneers of this type of format was Steven Seagal, known as the Seagull. Steven Seagal brought this new type of DJ to the two-pipe DJ format to the East Coast. He had been been working at an experimental radio station in LA, practicing an organic form of playing songs. Dave Bieber, the journalist, later said that Steve refined the current station concept of programming as a train of thought via music, creating montages of related sound bits, songs, and comedy pieces on the fly, thereby providing golden links in an intellectual or spiritual thread, made the station unique and great, and then putting two songs, greater than putting two songs back to back. Seagal also pioneered the news format that would shape WBCN. And depicted in this article on display here, Seagull talked about, Steven Seagal talked about sort of how he would create sort of this, or he would help to pioneer sort of this organic form of talking about the news. Rather than having a predictable newscast, he said later, describing the Democratic, or the riots of the Democratic Convention in 1968, that when he saw this happening, he couldn't refrain from talking about it. He saw his friends being clubbed, and his response was to respond in a somewhat frivolous but sarcastic way, in a way to call attention to what was going on. He also recalled the moment Robert Kennedy was assassinated in 1968. When he read the hospital bulletin, he decided spontaneously to play the song, "Come On People, Let's Get Together," just before the beginning of the broadcast. Said later at the end of the broadcast, said later that it fit beautifully. One of the men hired at WBCN was legendary broadcaster J.J. Jackson. J.J. Jackson was hired as one of the country's first African-American DJs on a major network. Jackson would introduce and interviewed and introduced the U.S. to Led Zeppelin on their first U.S. tour in 1969. He became famous and legendary for being the first to play the Who's Tommy on the air with Pete Townsend. He also introduced the Who at BU in Boston Garden, and introduced Jimi Hendrix at the Boston Garden. Later, he'll go on to become a well-known, even more well-known personality in LA on the radio, and one of the original MTV VJs in the early 1980s. Maxine Sartori would be one of the first females to be hired in a major radio market in the United States. And this is Maxine Sartori depicted here. After a sexist on-air comment, this sort of leads to Maxine's hiring. After a sexist on-air comment, a DJ had stated the station was looking for quote unquote chicks to hire. Women's rights protesters showed up at the protest the next day and released 35 chickens into the station manager's desk. WBCN responded to understanding the sexism in their hiring, responded by reaching out, looking to hire more women as DJs. Maxan, who was working in Seattle at the time, was hired to replace the departing J.J. Jackson. Maxan gained a reputation as a rocker and introduced the city to some of the soon-to-be national acts. In the early 1970s, she introduced a local band Aerosmith to the public. Later, local acts would be introduced, like the Jay Giles Band, the Cars. Maxine would introduce Boston Cars. Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band in 1973 would have their first national interview with Maxan on WBCN radio, exposing Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band to the greater public for the first time. The Lavender Hour in early 1970s would be one of the first radio stations, if not the first, to talk about LGBTQ plus issues in the United States openly. This is Andy Kopkine and John Scagliotti. They would be one of the first to openly talk about gay issues in the United States, and provide a open forum to talk about these issues. And famously, there was an on-air argument with David Bowie about his sexuality, urging him to come out. John Scagliotti on the right. And famous incident that John Scagliotti remembered later, a teen who was, because he listened to the Lavender Hour, decided not to commit suicide, as he was told later in the story, because of the Lavender Hour. And feeling some sense of acceptance in his life. So the important story and important um, groundbreaking radio broadcast here with the Lavender Hour. Depicted in this image is Don Law in 1969. Don Law was the talent man for WBCN, and it was Don Law who promoted these bands to come to Boston. Don Law will be very important in promoting the Boston Tea Party. He was the son of Don Law Sr., who had recorded Robert Johnson, the legendary blues artist, in 1936. His father had worked with Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, and Ray Price at Columbia Records in Nashville. And in 1966, Don Law and his band had opened for the Beatles at Suffolk Downs. In 1968, Don Law became the manager of the Boston Tea Party. And Law would use his connections as a promoter to recruit the largest British acts of the 1960s and 70s. And these would include Led Zeppelin, Fleetwood Mac, Jethro Tull, and 10 Years After, among many others. So who would you have seen at the Boston Tea Party at the height of its popularity? Well, depicted here is a calendar of 1969. You can see from just looking at the calendar a great variety of artists, many different types of music, including bands like 10 Years After, the Jay Giles Band, Albert King, Big Mama Thornton, who originally wrote the song Hound Dog, later recorded by Elvis Presley. And one of the unique aspects of the Tea Party was the variety of acts that would play together at the Boston Tea Party. One of the first bands to play at the Tea Party and become legendary later was the Velvet Underground. This is an image of the Velvet Underground in 1967, when they were just starting out independently. Lou Reed would famously say about the Boston Tea Party, "This is our favorite place to play in the whole country." Reed later said that he appreciated the diversity of the audience at the Tea Party, the mix of college kids, bikers, and white-collar professionals, and the fact that everyone seemed to come together at the Tea Party to listen to this music. And the Velvet Underground would go on to play many times at the Boston Tea Party over the next several years. But again, a diversity of acts playing at the Tea Party, including, as depicted here, the Buddy Miles Band. The Buddy Miles Band were Buddy Miles originally the drummer for the Jimi Hendrix Experience, with much more of a rock sound. And legendary bluesman Howlin' Wolf would play the same stage. So a different eclectic mix of artists. B.B. King would play his first Boston concert at his first Boston concert at the Tea Party 2 weeks after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. So he would help to sort of bring the city back together after those traumatic events. B.B. King had played in Boston before, but this was his first concert for playing large concert to play to largely white audiences. In 1969, jazz great Roland Kirk would open for The Who at the Boston Tea Party. So again, mix of eclectic styles. You also had bands such as the Allman Brothers, again opening for the Velvet Underground, two very contrasting styles on display at the Boston Tea Party. Reggae music would also be introduced through WBCN and the Boston Tea Party to large communities in the United States in the early 1970s. It was John Brody at WBCN who had been fascinated with reggae music ever since visiting Jamaica. He had arranged Jimmy Cliff's film The Harder They Come to be shown to popular acclaim at the Orson Welles Theater in Boston. This movie showed the difficulty of life in the slums of Trenchtown, and it popularized this style of music, or reggae style of music, in the United States. At one of the screenings, Jimmy Cliff himself had showed up at the screening, and Boston by the early 1970s had become a hub for reggae music. And in 1973, Bob Marley and the Wailers began their first U.S. tour in Boston in 1973. Other, of course, well-known bands would venture to the Boston Tea Party. Famous shows by Led Zeppelin in January of 1969. They would play their first U.S. tour at the Boston Tea Party. The Yardbirds would play famous well-known performances. The Grateful Dead would play a famous show in New Year's of series of shows in New Year's of 1970. And Elton John, on his first U.S. tour, would open at the Boston Tea Party near the end of the venue's run of performances. And one of the biggest benefits to youth in the 1960s and 70s was the amazing access that they would have to concert venues like the Boston Tea Party. A person at that time could see some of the biggest performers of the era for a few dollars or next to nothing. For this presentation, I interviewed Phil McKean, who lived in Boston in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Phil talked about seeing various bands in the area during that time. He talked about one of his friends, or talked about the venue itself, and one of his friends having an encounter with the Who's Keith Moon, who jumped over his back to reach the stage as the band came out through the crowd. Phil had seen through this time, saw the Allman Brothers, blues great Freddie King, the Byrds, and the Flying Burrito Brothers at Boston Summerthing Festival during this time. So one of the revolutionary things about the Boston Tea Party was the fact that people could access this great music for relatively small fees, and it gave great chance for people to experience this music. Depicted here, we have images of Master Blaster Charlie Daniels, a DJ, and Peter Wolf, famously later of the J. Geils Band. The next wave of DJs in the late 1970s were both promoters of music and musicians. Peter Wolf had got his start jamming with Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf at the Boston Tea Party. He had been recognized by for his talents, and he had come to WBCN as the second full-time DJ after Joe Rogers. Spending increasing time with his band, the J. Geils Band, Peter Wolf was asked to choose between being a rock star or a DJ. Sam Copper later said, "We gave Peter the option of overnights or being a rock star, and the rest is history." So during this time, the largest driver of the protest movement that was emerging in Boston in the United States was the Vietnam War. With the draft, young people's lives were directly affected by this unpopular war in Southeast Asia. Most of WBCN's DJs and personalities were young college kids at the time, and most likely to be directly affected by the war, and in many cases to protest the war. And it's WBCN DJs personally who would lead the growing protest movement in Boston against the Vietnam War. And depicted in this image is a protest movement at the Boston Common near the 54th Massachusetts, the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial, as young people would again lead much of the protest movement that would arise in opposition to the war in the 1960s. Depicted in this image is Danny Schechter. Danny Schechter will become known most famously in Boston as the news dissector. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the DJs on WBCN were young people, and most of them were of draft age, and they were directly affected by the war. And like the music they were listening to, the war was shaping their lives at the time. And Danny Schechter became famous in Boston for his news commentary. As I mentioned earlier, news on WBCN started almost by accident. There was no regular news coverage, but listeners in similar to what would be considered a social media conversation today would call in to comment on the news, and conversation would begin. And picking up on this, Ray Rippin would decide to make this official, and he would obtain a wire service connection with the British news service Reuters. This was done almost by accident. It was probably less because it was less expensive, is why Rippin picked it up. But it became important, or probably very relevant, because Reuters being a British news service, there were more access to or more different perspective than may be heard at other American-based wire news services on the war. When Bo Burlingame, the choice to lead the news, was indicted for being part of the Weather Underground, Danny Schechter would inherit the news job that he would hold on to for the next 10 years. Joe Rogers said later, there were a group of us at WBCN who believed we were on the verge of a political revolution in the US. And if you listen to an album like Volunteers by the Jefferson Airplane, it expressed our views of the time. We were pretty far out on the left in 1970, 71, and 72. This is an image of the Harvard campus takeover in 1970. Again, Schechter and others would be directly involved in this. Students had occupied the Harvard Campus Center. Danny Schechter would give a running commentary along the way and become eventually directly involved. Demonstrators were looking for connection between the Harvard administration and the U.S. government on policy and promoting the Vietnam War, which Harvard had denied. Schechter said Boston was a battleground of ideas, and we saw our purpose as part of the machine, we saw our purpose as preventing intellectual capital from being provided by public institutions like Harvard. Bill Lechenstein began his career as a WBCN as an intern at 14 years old. At WBCN, a stressed out Danny Schechter had told Lechenstein to come on the air at 16 years old. At 16, Lechenstein, who was an intern at the time, was brought on to interview protesters at a police state demonstration on Stewart Street in Boston. When he asked Schechter what should he do, Lichtenstein said, push the red button and ask why they are here. So this began a decades-long career in investigative journalism for Bill Lichtenstein, and that would go on to participate in WBCN, local journalism, and then nationally he became famous as a investigative journalist. So where is the balance between commerce and art? As the 1960s and 70s roll on, this becomes increasingly difficult to maintain at both the Boston Tea Party and WBCN. The popularity of rock music by the mid-1970s had left WBCN and the Tea Party both at odds with their larger market competitors. By depicted in the image here is the plaque for the Boston Tea Party at its new location on 15 Lansdowne Street in Boston. Ray Rippin and Don Law had bought a competitor, the Ark, and moved to this new venue in July of 1969. At this time, the popularity of rock music by the mid-1970s had left WBCN looking to find larger venues. The Tea Party had enjoyed unprecedented success, so that it had grown out of its Berkeley Street location and had to move to the 15 Lansdowne Street location. While some of the most famous concerts would take place at the new location at 15 Lansdowne Street, including concerts by The Who and the Grateful Dead. It definitely showed the increasing strain on local venues to hold these acts, which were becoming superstars in the rock world. And by the early 1970s, this became a serious issue, which would prove eventually fatal to the Boston Tea Party venue. Depicted here is the Boston Garden and the Orpheum Theater in the 1970s. By this time, the success of rock music in the mid-70s had led to performers looking for larger venues and larger paydays. By the 1970s, Don Law had become the leading promoter in the Boston area, promoting major acts which had become internationally famous. And after only 3 years, this led to the closing permanently of the Boston Tea Party in 1970. For a short period, the building was a disco in the late 1970s. But by the early 1970s, rock music was a multi-million-dollar industry, and these acts were commanding paydays that venues like the Boston Tea Party could no longer support. And as depicted here in this article from the Boston Globe on January 5th, 1971, the Boston Tea Party closed its doors permanently. WBCN at the time would also be having commercial issues arising from the protest movement on the radio station. Depicted here is an image of Honeywell cameras. Underground Camera in Boston was one of WBCN's largest sponsors. Charles LaQuerta, reading an ad for Underground Camera in Boston, realized sort of the problem with some of the promotion of protest and advertising. Honeywell at the time was the largest manufacturer of cluster bombs for the U.S. military in Vietnam. And having this promotion, and he talked about the ad, and then followed up saying, well, that's great if you want to kill babies in Vietnam. So Honeywell would subsequently sue WBCN. Honeywell Underground Camera would sue WBCN, and led to the end of that account. So we can see by the mid-1970s that the protest movement and commerce are keeping the lights on in a counterculture environment is becoming increasingly difficult. And by 1973, also the protest movement would largely falter out. In 1973, the U.S. ended its involvement in the Vietnam War with the peace treaty in that year. And President Nixon would resign in 1974 due to the cover-up in the Watergate scandal. Nixon and Vietnam were both symbols of the protest movement in the 1960s and 70s. And with both of their removal from the scene, the protest movement would falter or would dry up in the 1970s. Also, competition at the time for WBCN would come from a changing radio market, with the WCOZ, as depicted here, 94.5 in Boston, and the rise of the classical rock format in the 1970s changed the radio market once again. The market was switched to playing a style similar to Top 40 in classical rock, and now audiences could essentially choose what hits they wanted to listen to, and drove many listeners away from the Boston or WBCN to more classic rock format. And this was a shift back to a similar market to the old Top 40 format. In 1971, Ray Rippin would leave the Boston Tea Party. 1971, there was a successful unionization movement to unionize the workforce. And Ray Rippin later said that he felt stabbed in the back by this unionization effort. So in 1971, he would sell his remaining stake in the company and pack up and leave Boston. And with continuing labor issues in 1979, the new management company came in, fired nearly half of the WBCN staff. The strike that ensued was successful for WBCN's workforce, but many things at the station were changing. In the early 1970s, WBCN would move to the top of the Prudential Tower in Boston, in a much more corporate location. There were different perspectives on this. Danny Schechter later said, "I would go to work at 6 in the morning and walk around and look at Boston waking up and looking at the beauty of this area, and BCN was on top of it." John Brody had a different perspective. He said later that being up there was a daily reminder of how much value the station had on a business level. We kept resisting going along as best we could, but there was a certain realization this is not going to last forever. Our days are numbered. So WBCN would continue in its format until 2009, and it wasn't until the 1990s and the passage of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 that allowed more than one radio corporate entity to own a radio station in markets that eventually would help to drive WBCN to finally close in 2009. And this is a quote from John Scagliotti. He said, "I don't think we ever gave up," referring to WBCN. And he said, "I don't think we ever gave up. We discovered what was wrong and had new ways of changing things. The sound and the things we did were new, but it was all part of a big struggle that has been going on and still goes on." So today, WBCN and the Boston Tea Party no longer exist. But the changes in culture and music that became part of society. And in the end, this is what a revolution is: a fundamental change in the way people live that can't be taken away. WBCN and the Boston Tea Party played a critical role in the changing race, gender, and political changes that redefined the United States in the 1960s. So today, music industry is infinitely more complicated, but still today, supporting artists and independent radio stations is even more important in the 21st century. There are many more technological choices, but I think it's really important. It's still very important to listen to music you like, but also to buy and support artists and their music, and to support smaller market radio stations to preserve independence and creativity in the music industry. So that concludes my presentation, but in honor of the legacy of the Boston Tea Party and WBCN, which that legacy still continues today, I'd like to play a brief 2-minute clip of music and radio from the 1960s and 70s. So thank you to the BPL and the BPL for presenting this presentation today, and I'd like to play this clip. Thank you.
Wish that I could tell her everything I want to. The world is full of things we want to know. We tumble from the top to far below.
Gabba Gabba Gabba. This will be good for Mama Tuba Hoppa Dupa listening to WBCN FM 104.1 in Boston. And you know what?
The Allman Brothers, Buddy Guy, Junior Wells, the Stooges, the Amboy Dukes, Catfish, the American Dream, Swallow, the MC5, Big Brother and the Holding Company, Stock Forest, and of course, Led Zeppelin. Wow, so that's...
Well, she went up to a room and she sang a faithful tune.
We should seal our consciences and recognize that this unprecedented event should make us force the Congress to turn this country around.
That was Congressman Drinan about a half an hour ago in Government Center speaking to Vietnam veterans against the war.
Hello, Bruce Springsteen.
We're on the air?
Yeah, we're on the air.
Hey! all right. Is the tuba mic all right? Senorita, play guitar, plays it just for you. My rosary has broken, my beads have all slipped through.
Over and out.
Awesome. Thanks, Will.
Thanks. Thanks.
Let me pull up I got a couple questions here and then we can turn it back over to Karen. All right, so let me see. So what triggered your interest in researching this subject?
Well, I mean, I've always loved music, and I also love obviously history. So, and I love how these things, history and music, kind of come together, and just sort of telling the story of the culture of the time. And it was just sort of came to this WBCN and the Tea Party, and came out really, it was perfect.
Awesome. Do you happen to know where the WBCN archival material is housed?
I do. So it's at UMass Amherst. So a lot of it's online, a lot of the photos and images in the physical archive is at UMass Amherst.
Easy enough. So do you happen to know the name of the band that Don Law played with when he opened for the Beatles?
I do. I thought I put it in the PowerPoint. Let me go back and pull that up. Let's see. Can I just go back here? Hold on, maybe it's in my notes. Sorry.
No, all good. While you're doing that, just have a question come in. Could you speak a little bit to the importance of Charles Lacaderia for BCN?
Well, I came across him in the research a little bit, but I'm trying to think. I mean, he was an important commentator, I realize. I can't remember exactly as really specifically right now, but I can look into that a little more.
Yeah, I think he definitely plays a role a little bit later. I think he had a show called like The Big Mattress or something like that, and was really important for early morning drive time radio.
That's right. Yeah, it was a comedy show, sort of pseudo comedy show. I remember now. It was more, I think, more in the 1980s, a little bit on the research area. Yeah.
Yeah, he had I think he had like an alternative personality where he was like Dwayne Glasscock or something like that. I think that was like a part of his shtick. Awesome. And then final question. Wondering if you could speak a little bit to what Boston meant on like the band's kind of traveling circuit, like versus a stop in like New York City or other major areas. Like what, like, I know you talked definitely about it a little bit, obviously, but the importance of Boston as a stop.
Yeah, sure. I mean, of course, Boston became such an important scene, music scene, because of its the promotion of these various acts. So it became very important because it was the first place a lot of these bands would go. Obviously, New York is the major market, biggest market in the country, but a lot of these bands would go to Boston specifically to play at the Boston Tea Party because they could get exposure, and also through WBCN. So there was this sort of network, and once once you got exposure there, you could be promoted to play at the Tea Party, and at WBCN, you would pick up national coverage if you didn't already have that already. So it became a really important stop for that reason.
Awesome. Thanks, Will. All right. So in the interest of time, I'm happy to turn it back over to Karen to close us out.
Oh, I did not start my video yet. Hello. As always, I'm always just so greatly impressed. Thank you so much. This was so informative, and also I really have I had like typing fingers where I'm like, oh, what's that? And I need to go research it quickly, and then research this side quickly, and also I truly believe they need to bring back the what is it? Youth access to concerts. I would have loved that. Now, as of next week, I'm now bumped out of the youth demographic, which is rude. But I would have appreciated that. And honestly, a lot of Bostonians right now would really appreciate that. Because I recently saw Aerosmith at Fenway last year, and it was not $5 like that wonderful Rod Stewart ticket. But it was an amazing concert. They still fantastic. Anyway, thank you so much. This was absolutely amazing. And please join us in 2 weeks on April 24th for our very last presentation. And that will be Their Dreams, Their Rights, Their Love, Exploring Beacon Hill and Boston's LGBTQ plus history. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Karen. Bye.
Bye.